Chapter 5 Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, I muttered in shock as Rafe escorted me and my teammates through a set of reinforced steel gates and into Howler's Hold, which sat in the belly of an enormous indoor sports complex and gymnasium. We strode into a broad courtyard hemmed in by stacks of towering shipping containers, which had been converted into apartments and shared living spaces. Huge ladders and rickety wooden staircases lead to a series of metal catwalks that zigzag through the air overhead, running from everywhere to everywhere else, connecting the sprawl of quadcons like strands of metal spider webbing. The Howlers had turned the place into a Mad Max, post-apocalyptic city, which was as depressing as it was impressive. All of that, however, paled in comparison to the true revelation. They are furries, I said mostly to myself. They are all furries. Once again, the backrooms had managed to Chuck Norris roundhouse kick me right in the teeth. Loitering in the courtyard and moving languidly along those catwalks were furries of every shape and size and description. There were owls and leopards, multicolored wolves and foxes with dopey, oversized eyes. The Howlers existed on a spectrum, some wearing only cat ears or a fluffy tail, while others were decked out from head to toe in elaborate outfits that covered every inch of skin. There was even someone dressed in one of those inflatable dinosaur costumes. I was genuinely at a loss for words. Just why, though? Of course they are, Rafe replied over one shoulder. Howler's Hold is a furry settlement. Didn't anyone tell you? He asked, sounding amused by my obvious discomfort. Guess it never came up, I replied sheepishly, trying not to openly ogle at the odd assortment of inhabitants, casually going about their business. Several Howlers nodded or waved to Rafe, but other than a few curious glances, most didn't pay as much mind. This was just another day in paradise for them. That's not going to be a problem, is it? Rafe asked on a more serious note. I only had to think about it for a heartbeat before answering. Nope, not a problem at all, I replied with a thin smile. Not even a little bit. They said war made strange bedfellows, and I'd never realized how true that was until this exact moment. Sure, furries may have weirded me out on general principle, but temperance was a friend, and Rafe seemed okay. Would I ever fully understand their choices? Nope. But so long as they were trustworthy, good in a brawl, and loaded down with disposable income that they were willing to spend at my store, I didn't need to understand them. Especially since they were willing to help me fight a bunch of Hellraiser rejects who enjoyed flaying the skin off their bodies. Give me furries any day of the week over that tomfoolery. Though I do have questions, I said, as Rafe ushered us through the courtyard and into a man-made canyon that cut between the towering stacks of shipping containers, which comprised the bulwark of the makeshift Delver City. Though, on closer inspection, it became evident that these weren't your run-of-the-mill everyday shipping containers. They'd been heavily modified, fitted with windows and sliding doors. Some of the upper units even had small patios, crafted from slabs of concrete and rebar or wooden slats. So many questions, I added, glancing through some of the windows as we walked. There were furries here and there, but there were also plenty of regular, non-fur-clad folk as well. They were just going about their lives. Cooking or cleaning. Playing board games or reading novels. Everything was so shockingly mundane, it was disorienting. A dizzying array of tags flickered above their heads, here then gone, listing out biotag ID numbers and Delver levels. Most of them were pitifully weak and only a handful were above level 15. It was like they'd survived long enough to find their way here, then just never left again. And why would they? It was dangerous and scary out in the back rooms. 1,000 evils waited around every corner to kill the unwary. Traps and monsters. Blight and other delvers. Vengeful deities and warring factions. Death lay outside these walls. But here was safety. Normalcy. In a manner of speaking, anyway. What question is at the top of your list? Rafe spoke loudly to be heard over the constant hum of generators, which powered strings of patio lights and the bulky AC units which jutted from the containers like metal tumors. For starters, how in the hell did y'all end up here? I asked, racking my brain, desperately trying to figure out how so many furries hadn't clipped into the back rooms. It just didn't seem possible. That's a funny story, actually, Rafe replied. Although we've collected a few stragglers since we founded the hold, most of us simultaneously clipped together from West Recon 52, back in July of 1998. There were 317 of us. Most of us were furries, though there were 30 or so regular con-goers mixed in as well. We all went to a party in the basement of a San Diego Marriott and woke up in the lobby the next day. No one could quite remember what had happened or how we'd gotten there. Wait, so all of you just disappeared? I snapped my fingers. Gone, just like that, and no one noticed? Rafe snorted and rolled his eyes. Of course, people noticed. I have no doubt that the disappearance of so many senior software engineers and programmers directly contributed to the Y2K scare. He shrugged broad shoulders. Mostly it got swept under the rug, though. Back in the late 90s, openly being a furry was a good way to get the shit kicked out of you, so most of us hadn't told anyone where we were going or why. Plus, we were all from over different parts of the country, so no one really put two and two together. We slipped past the series of large planters, which lined the rather cramped walkways. They were filled with a riot of vegetables. Fat red tomatoes and bulbous green cabbage. Climbing green beans and vines budding with fist-sized bell peppers. Grow lights, mounted to the exterior container walls, served to keep the foliage healthy. There were also quite a few fruits and vegetables that I'd never seen before. One in the perfect shape of a star. Another that pulsed with eerie green light. They looked like something harvested from a different world entirely. Rafe's answer left me with more questions, not less. I'm sorry, but how in the hell do 317 people all simultaneously clip? It's called a mass displacement event, he replied, all the while guiding us through a confusing warren of interconnected streets and claustrophobic cut-throughs. It doesn't happen often, but it does happen. Why it happens, no one seems to know. What I can tell you is that we weren't the first, and I doubt we'll be the last. Legend has it that the same thing happened to the colonists of Roanoke and the legionnaires of the 9th Roman Legion. Are you shitting me? The 9th Roman Legion? I asked, squinting skeptically. That can't be right. Didn't they disappear like 2,000 years ago? Closer to 2,300, actually, Jacob offered without prompting. According to historians, they vanished in 108 AD. You really think the backrooms have been around for that long? I asked. No idea, Rafe replied, shaking his shaggy head. Like I said, it's just a long-standing legend. I've never personally seen any proof. Could all be a bunch of bullshit, though I wouldn't be completely shocked if it turned out to be true. Weirder things have happened, and the progenitor ship's been feeding on our reality for an awfully long time. You're still new here, but if you survive long enough, you'll see for yourself. The deeper down you go, the older things get. Best we can figure, the backrooms runs a few decades behind the real world. That's why a lot of the shit up near the lobby looks like it got ripped straight out of the 80s and 90s. Because it did. Head down 20 or 30 floors, though. Things start to look more like the 60s and 70s. Below that? Who knows? I've heard stories about ancient pyramids and Arthurian castles. We had one guy pass through here about 5 years ago who claimed he'd found the entire lost city of Atlantis. He was insane, so take that with a grain of salt. What about the 99th floor? I asked, thinking about Steamboat Studios and the kiosk I'd just acquired. Know anything about it? Never made it that deep myself, Rafe said, but I've heard a few people talk about that floor. Unless I'm wrong, that's where the franchise lives. I don't know anything about it except this: people who go there don't come back. I know you're out here taking wild chances and slaughtering sacred cows like you're getting ready to throw a neighborhood block party, but between me and you, stay the hell away from the 99th floor. I grunted non-committally in reply. The winding pathway dumped us unceremoniously into an open space that served as a makeshift park. There were several benches of varying designs arrayed around the patch of fake turf with one of those backyard playhouses assembled at the center. This was the first time I'd seen anything that came close to grass since the clipping. Even though I knew it wasn't real, a small part of me wanted to flop down and stare up at the sky. But there was no sky, I reminded myself. Just the domed ceiling of a sports complex. Truth was, I'd probably never see the sky again. I shook the morbid thought away as the sound of laughter caught my attention. Holy shit balls. There were kids here. A whole mess of them. Some as young as 2 or 3, doddering around on unsteady legs, others as old as 12 or 13. I even spotted a mother cradling a newborn, not far off. Meanwhile, the older kids were chasing each other around, screaming and giggling wildly as they ducked outstretched hands and hurtled over the playground equipment. This is nowhere near the muslin mast, Temperance commented offhanded. No, it isn't, Wraith agreed with a nod, but this was something I needed Dan to see. All of the humor and easy smiles were gone now. Instead, there was a somberness to the man that hadn't been there before. There was a vulnerability etched into the lines of his bovine face, as though he were offering me a glimpse at something precious but fragile. I wanted to show you why we're doing this. What we're fighting for. What I'm fighting for. You're new here, Dan, new enough to still be ambitious. To think about getting answers or finding a way out. But us? He shook his head. Most of us have made peace with the fact that we'll never leave the back rooms. That this is where we're going to die. And that's okay. We've been here long enough to settle down. To carve out a life for ourselves. To have kids. He stretched out a hand and motioned to the sea of smiling and laughing faces, darting across the turf. None of these kids clipped into the back rooms. Every single one of them was born here. The Hold, it isn't just some temporary survival camp. Not for us. For better or worse, this is our home now. We fought tooth and nail to make this place a reality, and we lost lots of good men and women to do it. It's my job to keep this place and these people safe, and partnering with you puts all of this in jeopardy. Making an alliance with you is going to bring war to our doorstep, and even if everything goes right, people are going to die. There was a sad glimmer in his eyes. Their parents might die. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Because I believe in you, and I believe in what you're doing, but I also want you to believe in us. To know what's on the line. This is what I'm risking by putting my trust in you, Dan. He paused, and locked eyes with me. Make sure you're worth it. He fell silent for a long moment. Now, as much as I'd love to chaperone you, he continued after a beat, I've been gone too long already. I need to do the rounds. Make sure nothing is on fire. I'm sure Temperance can show you to Ajax, but if you need anything else, don't hesitate to reach out. I'll be here. He extended a furry hand as a peace offering. I gave it a firm pump without a second thought. The bull-headed tribune snorted, then turned and made his way across the turf, stopping to ruffle a kid's hair in passing, before trundling up a rickety staircase and disappearing into the maze of metal catwalks above. Asterisk. Jacob and Croc chit-chatted amicably, the dog telling the Sandrel about my new taxidermied minions and our close encounter with the kiosk crab, while Temperance guided us to the muslin mast, where she assured us Ajax would be waiting. Apparently, he never strayed far from the place. For my part, I was quiet. Seeing those kids had hit me harder than I'd expected, which was probably the reason Wraith had shown them to me in the first place. These were real people with real lives and real families, and the choices I made would affect them all. Even though this was a world with stats and levels and magic, I needed to remind myself that it wasn't a game. If I fucked this up, I wasn't the only one who would end up skinned alive. Before, I'd been fighting to save my own hide. But now? Now the stakes were even higher. For the first time, I began to seriously entertain the idea of killing the flayed monarch. Until this point, my primary goal had been to simply survive against the crimson monster with unspeakable power and far too many legs. Now, though, I was starting to rethink my goals. Maybe survival wasn't enough. The idea of killing something as powerful as the monstrous creature I'd seen in the lobby seemed laughable, and yet, was it really so ridiculous? The boundless wanderer had nearly managed to do it. Why not me? Chapter 6. I was still lost in thought when Temperance finally shepherded us out of the sprawling labyrinth and right to the doorstep of the muzzle and mast. With a name like Ajax, I'd half expected the place to resemble a Thunderdome-esque murder arena, where post-apocalyptic warriors battled each other for sport in front of a cheering crowd of bloodthirsty spectators. But nope. The muzzle and mast turned out to be the hold's only tavern, and it sat in the belly of a bona fide pirate ship. The ship looked like something ripped straight off the high seas and stranded on a sandbar. Except the sandbar in question was an enormous high school gymnasium in a backwards Alice in Wonderland murder world. The planks were graying and weathered as though the ship had seen long years on the tossing waves, and dried barnacles peppered the worn hull. 3 huge masts jutted upward like skeletal fingers, nearly brushing the ceiling high above. There was no sign of the sails or rigging, but a giant masthead, carved to resemble a snarling wolf's head, protruded from the prow. Where in the hell they'd found a pirate ship was a mystery I couldn't even begin to hazard a guess at. How they'd managed to get the damned thing in here was an even bigger head-scratcher. Though, I suppose, it couldn't have been much tougher than moving in all the shipping containers. A wide variety of howlers partied on the ship's upper deck, dancing and drinking as thumping music blared from a pair of huge speakers affixed to the various masts. There was no obvious way to get to the upper deck from the outside, so instead I shouldered my way into the lower hull through a pair of wooden batwing doors that looked like they'd been pilfered from the Old West Saloon shootout in the Jungle Gym arcade. The air inside stopped me dead in my tracks. The whole place was musky and eye-wateringly sour. The reek of pungent hookah smoke, stale beer, and overwhelming body odor hit me like a fist to the nose. I staggered at the reek, actively suppressing the urge to throw up in my mouth. A flash of regret washed over me, and suddenly I had a desperate and intense desire to turn around and go anywhere else. Someone needed to airdrop a bathtub worth of Febreze into this place. Not that I had much room to talk. Even after all that scrubbing and a fresh coat of deodorant, I still smelled like a Northwest Pacific fishing boat left too long in the sun. "I think something might have died in here, Dan," Krog whispered, just loud enough to be heard over the murmur of the crowd and the lonely twang of a guitar. "It smells worse than the sewers on the second floor." I shuddered just thinking about the claustrophobic and disgusting jumble of tunnels that comprised the second floor, which I'd affectionately labeled the Devil's Asshole. The whole level was dank, gross, filled with suffering, and overflowing with literal shit. I'd contracted a nasty case of sludge lung while tramping around in the pungent waterways, and the disease had damn near killed me. I'd spent the better part of day in a nightmarish delirium, vacillating between a blazing fever and teeth-chattering chills, all while projectile vomiting and hallucinating my ass off. Fuck that whole level. "It's not that bad," I muttered, eyeballing the crowd. "Now let's just stay focused and get this over with." Nearly a dozen howlers lounged on giant beanbags or stuffed couches, both of which looked wildly out of place inside of the hold of a 16th-century pirate ship. Several were smoking hookah pipes, unleashing plumes of blue-gray smoke so thick they clouded the air and made it difficult to see. The skunky scent of weed also lingered, warring with the sweet aroma of tobacco. There were a handful of howlers clustered around a circular table, where another pair sat across from each other locked in a fervent battle of Magic the Gathering. I was in no way shocked. A woman wearing a pair of cat ears and a skin-tight bodysuit sat on the stage, picking at a battle-worn acoustic guitar that had seen better days. She plucked out a slow and melodic version of Hotel California. Her sultry voice was almost as smoky as the air. Temperance sauntered up beside me and hooked one arm through mine, then pointed across the crowded interior to a lone figure, loitering behind a polished, hardwood bar that ran along the length of the far wall. The man wore a shaggy crimson fox suit with large ears, black forearms, and a tuft of black hair that resembled a mohawk. That would be Ajax, proprietor of the muzzle and mast, and 1/3 of the Tribunal of Howlers' hold. All we need to do is win him over to lock down the vote and cement the alliance. Wraith is right about him. He is a drama queen of the highest order and a bit of an ass, but as long as you know that going in, we should be fine. I had my doubts about that. Knowing how these things tended to go, I had a strong suspicion that securing his vote wouldn't be as easy as it sounded. These things never were. If Ajax really was as selfish and self-serving as Rafe made him out to be, it almost certainly meant he was going to ask me to do something stupid and or dangerous, probably both, to secure his support. Great. Perfect. Awesome, I grumbled. I'm sure this is not at all going to be a Herculean task of hellish proportions. Taking a deep breath, which I immediately regretted, I squared my shoulders and strode toward the bar with the others in tow. There were a couple of howlers lurking at the counter. Both offered me questioning glances as I approached, but quickly moved away with beer mugs in hand. More of the tavern-goers had finally taken notice of our arrival, and there was a palpable tension gathering in the air which hadn't been there before. Almost as though they suspected violence might break out at any moment, and they were all collectively preparing to break for cover. Couldn't say I blamed them. As the most infamous and wanted man in the backrooms, I was sure there were a lot of rumors flying around about me. Some of them were probably true, and others were undoubtedly false. These people wouldn't know the difference, though. All they would know for sure was that I was dangerous with a capital D after all. If the skinless court was willing to pay top dollar for my head, then surely there had to be a damned good reason. A quick scan with the researcher's codex also revealed that none of the bargoers were above level 13, save Ajax who was level 19, which also helped explain their obvious apprehension. If we had a mind to, we could kill everyone in here and it wouldn't even be hard. I sidled up to the bar and slipped onto one of the stools, while Croc wedged its body between the counter and my legs. Then the mimic spun in a tight circle and plopped down, staying silent but facing the crowd, which gave me some small measure of comfort. I didn't much like having my back exposed to a room full of potentially hostile delvers, even if they were all relatively weak. Knowing Croc at my 6 eased my worry. Jacob slipped onto a stool on my right, and swiveled, so he too had eyes on the bar's patrons. Temperance took the stool to my left and leaned up against the bar, a wide grin spreading across her face. "I'll take a gin and tonic," she ordered without a preamble. The fox pulled a glass from beneath the bar, then fished out a bottle filled with sapphire blue liquor from the shelf behind him. The bar was surprisingly well stocked, the shelves loaded with rum and vodka, tequila and bourbon, gin and whiskey of a dozen different varieties. "It's good to see you survived your excommunication, darling," the fox replied, sliding the drink to Temperance. "Jacob," he said, nodding respectfully at the central. "Ajax," Jacob replied with a curt dip of his head, though he kept one eye glued on the crowd. "It's been years," Ajax said to the central. "And you've made it to level 26? Impressive. It seems your time away has served you well. Any chance you've finally decided to put down roots? Last time you were here, they offered you a job as a tribune to get you to stay. It's a shame you turned them down. Jackson has become an unbelievably pretentious twat since he took the post. Absolutely unbearable. Das ist sehr nett." "I appreciate the sentiment," Jacob replied evenly, "but I never was one for local politics. Besides, there are still so many answers yet to find and I'm not ready to stop looking." Ajax harumphed and crossed furry arms across his chest. "I forgot how boring you are. So polite and well-mannered. Like watching wet paint dry." He turned his gaze on me. "And who are your new friends, huh?" The fox gave me a once-over, then glanced over the counter at Croc. "They look interesting." Temperance rolled her eyes. "Do we really need to do this song and dance, Ajax? We both know you have eyes and ears everywhere. Nothing happens in the hold that you do not already know about." "That's true, dear, but the least you could do is play along and let me have a little fun." He sighed and sniffed in disapproval. "Since our dearest Temperance insists on sucking all the joy out of everything. Allow me to introduce myself. I'm Ajax the Fabulous, proprietor of the Muzzle and Mast, the finest bar and club in Howler's Hold." "The only bar and club in Howler's Hold," Jacob corrected. Ajax ignored him, completely unfazed. "Charmed to meet you," he finished, extending a paw. Not wanting to be rude, I accepted and gave it a shake. "Good to meet you too, I'm Discount Dan, the fox interjected before I could get my name out. It doesn't take a genius to see who you are, especially in that delightful ensemble you're wearing. You might not be aware, Daniel, but you're the buzz of the hold. From what I hear, our dearest leader Wraith even decided to play diplomatic envoy and personally paid you a visit. You should feel honored. Plus, Jackson positively loathes you, which is another mark in your favor. I dare say, you might end up being quite a lot of fun. Oh, he's loads of fun? Croc said from the floor. Have you ever been on the big slide at the Jungle Gym Jamboree? The one that takes you from the big tent all the way to the exit? Well, Dan took me in honestly, it's the closest thing to heaven on earth I've ever experienced. He also lets me eat as much froyo as I want and, eventually, we're going to visit one of the water parks on the lower floors. Plus, he's a big fan of the Twilight book series, just like me. Big fan is an overstatement, I grumbled. I only read the first one. And only because I was on deployment and there was nothing else to read. Well, look at you, Ajax beamed. Aren't you just the sweetest, dumbest creature on God's green earth? You must be Croc. He scanned the dog, taking in the rubbery pockmarked texture of the mimic's skin and its huge goggly eyes. I've heard about you too, though you're much less murdery than I was expecting. Yeah, that's what pretty much everyone says about me, Croc replied. Usually, people scream when they see me and call me things like an eldritch nightmare or a fleshy abomination unto the Lord before trying to kill me with fire. But not Dan. He saw that I'm really a good boy, who occasionally gets a little peckish for the flesh of my enemies. Oh my God, you're so adorable it's physically painful, the fox gushed at the mimic. Then he shot a sideways glance at me. I always did like a man who can look past an entire dump truck worth of red flags. Sorry buddy, there's not enough booze in the world to make me look past all the red flags you're waving, I said. But, Temperance did mention that we might be able to cut a business deal. Great banter, the fox said, rubbing at his chin thoughtfully. I'm a slut for good banter. Yes, you might be a little fun indeed, Daniel. Just Dan, I tried to say, but Ajax had already moved on. The barkeep turned toward the crowd and raised his voice. Out, all of you. The playful tone of moments before was gone. These were the words of a man who expected to be obeyed. The music from the stage cut off with a sharp jangle and the words died in the singer's throat. Although there were a few muttered protests, the bargoers packed up their belongings and shuffled out, leaving the place empty, save for us and Ajax. I could still hear the thump of EDM flowing down from a set of rough-hewn stairs that led to the upper deck, but Ajax didn't seem to notice. Once Ajax was sure there was no one else around, he pulled the fox head off and set it on the countertop with a long sigh of relief. That thing gets positively stifling without AC. He paused, a dreamy look flickering across his face. God, I'd give my left nut for proper a fan inside this thing. After dealing with Wraith, I was half expecting Ajax to be an actual fox or some other kind of transmog, but he was human, although he did have surprisingly foxish features. The man had a swath of sweaty red hair that drooped onto his forehead, a pale complexion dusted with freckles, and high cheekbones sharp enough to cut glass. Green eyes regarded me with strange intensity. Now, let's not beat around the bush, Ajax said, leaning against the edge of the bar top. You're here, gracing my lowly doorstep because you need my blessing if you want to open shop here in the hold. I'm assuming that means Wraith has already paid you a visit? Temperance asked, idly swirling her gin and tonic. He didn't need to, Ajax replied. He announced that he was supporting your endeavor over the PA system. Everyone and their brother knows exactly where he stands. Say what you will about Wraith, but the man has conviction. Someone else did come stomping by, however. I'll give you one guess who it was. He sounded supremely unamused. Jackson, Temperance replied flatly. Indeed, darling. And he wasn't alone. He came with a whole troop of his goons. They broke one of my tables, by accident, of course. He air-quoted a word. They also strongly imply that more misfortune might befall my humble establishment unless I cast my vote against a certain bathrobed entrepreneur. I've never seen Jackson this worked up. He paused and stole a knowing glance at Temperance. I suspect it has far less to do with Daniel here. He reached over and patted me on the hand, and far more to do with getting back at you. He is very upset that you managed to worm your way back in here, after what you did to him. As far as I'm concerned, he brought it upon himself, Temperance said. I warned him more than once not to lay a hand upon me. He should have heeded my words more carefully. Wait, I'm sorry. So let me see if I have this right, I said. This douchebag assaults Temperance, and she is the one who gets kicked out, and now he's actively trying to shake you down and everyone is just okay with it. It's complicated, Ajax replied, and political. For better or worse, this is like one of those CW shows where everything boils down to one big popularity contest. Unfortunately, Jackson is popular. And maybe you should climb down off your high horse, Daniel. Unless I am very much mistaken, you're here to actively bribe me. You and Jackson are both trying to accomplish the same thing, even if you're going about it in different ways. Even if I wanted to refute his point, I couldn't. Not really. Much as it pained me to admit, Ajax was right. Not that it mattered. This was about survival, and although there were certainly some ethical lines I wasn't willing to cross, a little bribery wasn't one of them. It just turns out, Ajax continued after a beat, that I respond better to honey than to vinegar, especially because I happen to think this little enterprise of yours is absolutely fabulous. I sent out one of my retainers, and he's been singing your praises ever since he got back. Honestly, having one of your adorers here will make my life so much easier. With that said, even though I think a potential partnership is great for the whole and for me personally, it's still going to cost you. Why? I asked instead, brow furrowed in confusion. You said it yourself, this benefits both of us. Yes, but it doesn't benefit both of us equally, Daniel, Ajax replied with a mischievous smile. You're still quite new here, so perhaps you haven't learned this lesson yet. Please allow me to be your sensei. In the backrooms, there is no free lunch. You want something, and I have the power to give it to you. You need me far more than I need you in this equation, which is why you're going to do a few things to guarantee my cooperation. I ground my teeth in frustration but nodded. This was just the cost of doing business, I reminded myself. So glad you're amenable. First, I will need someone to help protect me in my establishment until this all blows over. Jackson doesn't have the manpower to bully me indefinitely, but he can certainly make a nuisance of himself for a few weeks. If you want my vote, you'll need to keep Jackson and his band of miscreants off my back until you take care of my other requests. I would be delighted to handle that, Temperance replied, a malevolent smile curling her lips. Jackson may be a lost cause, but perhaps I can beat a little common sense into the others. I thought you might be open to helping, Ajax said with a lopsided smile. But a little extra protection isn't all I require. I also want a 50% discount on all in-store purchases. Nope, I shot back straight away. Not going to happen. If I let you do that, what's to stop you from coming in, buying everything you can carry at a steep discount, then reselling here and undercutting my prices? What I can do is offer you a 10% personal discount, plus I'd be willing to negotiate a cheaper wholesale price for certain goods, but only if you buy in bulk. Ajax pouted and drummed his fingers on the countertop. Fine, I suppose I would be amenable to those terms. I don't suppose you'd be willing to discuss selling some items on consignment? Yeah, we could work out an arrangement, I said, though I'm not ready to nail down commission percentages just yet. Of course, Ajax replied, waving away the comment as though things were already decided. Then there's just one other tiny little thing. A small favor really. The man steepled his fingers like a Bond villain. The way he said small favor made me think it would be anything but. What else do you need? I asked, already bracing for impact. A feverish light washed across Ajax's face as he leaned closer. I want access to laundry services. Laundry services? Oh yes, Daniel, laundry services. Chapter 7 Laundry services. It wasn't the strangest request I'd ever heard. That achievement belonged to Croc, who'd once asked for Froyo right after narrowly escaping a nightmarish Pac-Man creature the size of a Volkswagen. It was a strong contender for second place, though. After hearing Ajax rant for the better part of a half hour, however, his request started to make more sense. Turned out, getting fursuits clean even under ideal circumstances was a tricky business. Getting them clean inside the backrooms. Yeah, that was almost impossible. The suits couldn't be steam cleaned, and though the hold had a small suite of washing machines, they were always backed up. Plus, many of the most delicate accessories, like the head and paws, needed to be gently hand-washed. Hand-washing sweat out of a fursuit was one thing. But blood, vomit, oil, shit, 1,000 other unspeakable fluids and substances? Nope. No way. Living in the backrooms was akin to receiving a doctorate in disgusting, and the Howlers were more acutely aware of that than anyone. Most of the suits were also powerful artifacts, which meant they were extremely durable and would self-repair over time. But they didn't self-clean, and blood was real hard to scrub out. On this issue, at least, the Howlers and I had common ground. My shirt was a tie-dyed swirl of pink blood and blue crab viscera, my ratty bathrobe smelled like the inside of a hot porta-shitter, and my shorts were so matted with sweat and grim they could stand up on their own. I could only imagine how much worse it was for the Howlers, who were all trapped inside what amounted to fur-covered hazmat suits. And they couldn't ditch their outfits any easier than I could ditch mine, no matter how much they might want to. Like my stupid fucking bathrobe, which I hated, the suits were simply too powerful. Trading them would be like Tony Stark sticking his Iron Man armor in the closet. Which is why, with the cloying stench of my own body odor assaulting my nose, I listened to Ajax's rant with keen interest. According to the Fox, there existed a very special place. A laundry room, nestled deep in the bowels of the 5th floor, which contained a pair of locationally bound artifact washers. Washers capable of cleaning anything. Many of the Howlers made a pilgrimage there once every couple of years or so, as though visiting some sacred shrine. But it was a perilous journey, and many who set out in search of cleaner pastures never made it back. Rumor had already spread far and wide about my unique ability to acquire bits and pieces of the backrooms, so naturally, Ajax wanted me to find the sacred laundry room of the 5th floor and tack it on to Discount Dan's backroom bargains. Not only would doing so make me extremely popular with the Howlers, but it would also buy me enough goodwill to win Ajax's vote. 2 birds, 1 stone. It was a big ask, though, not only because I'd have to find the location and kill whatever lived there to lay a claim, but because I only had so much square footage to work with. Adding the laundromat meant I wouldn't be able to add something else down the road. Still, as the rancid stink of my own clothes tickled my nostrils, I found myself happily agreeing. Truthfully, I'd been meaning to add some sort of laundry service to the store anyway, and if it would lock in a lucrative partnership with the Howlers at the same time, it would be more than worth it. I'd hardly spent any amount of time on the 5th floor, and though I doubted it was any more dangerous than the 7th floor, home to both Howlers Hold and the Jungle Gym Jamboree, I didn't want to take anything for granted. Back in Iraq, our convoy commander, Captain Donahue, had one simple mantra that he'd repeat ad nauseam: complacency kills. Only the paranoid survive. That advice was right on the money and had saved my ass more than once. Hell, despite Croc's very vocal warnings, I'd gotten complacent about taking on the kiosk boss, and it had nearly cost me my life. It was on the 3rd floor for Pete's sake. It had never occurred to me that there might be something as powerful as Frank dwelling in plain sight. I'd been dead wrong. In theory, the 5th floor would be far more dangerous than the 3rd, and there was no telling what I might end up facing in a sacred laundromat with powerful artifacts. I couldn't afford to take stupid chances or go in unprepared, especially since I'd be venturing into the floor short-handed. I'd have Jacob and Croc with me, as well as my disgusting new minions, but Temperance was staying behind at the hold, pulling guard duty to ensure Jackson and his zealots left Ajax in peace. So, before we delved into the twisting hallways of the 5th floor, I had some business to take care of. I had to restock my cache of potions and elixirs, level up a few of my relics, And I also needed to spend some time familiarizing myself with one of the relics I'd received from Funtime Frank and the gang, Runic Resonance Trap. Despite only being an uncommon great relic, it was the first and only trap relic I'd come across since venturing into the backrooms. Given how common traps were, I was sure there were others floating around, but so far, they'd been tricky to find. I suspected that was because the majority of the floor traps weren't set by dwellers or other delvers, but by the backrooms themselves. They were just another part of the floor design, like carpet, or wallpaper, or drinking fountains. I'd previously picked up a trap with spry bar at prize booth on level 7, so I had everything I needed to get started. The real problem was that I hadn't had enough time to properly master the fundamentals of the relic. Most relics were relatively simple to use and rather intuitive in design. All an intrepid delver had to do was pop one into their spatial core, and boom, they had instant magic at their fingertips. In most instances, the relics themselves imprinted a certain level of knowledge directly into the user's head. Like Neo, plugging into that badass kung fu machine in the Matrix. I call those set single quotum and forget single quotum relics. There were exceptions to that rule, however. Some relics had a rather steep learning curve and required a fair degree of practice or experimentation to use effectively. Mental micromanagement was a good example, and so was my other new relic, Unhinged Taxidermist. That one was as much art as it was science. I couldn't just summon a minion all willy-nilly. I needed to cobble them together from the leftover remains of enemies, but I also needed to counterbalance the organic material with an appropriate amount of mechanical material. It had taken me days to figure out how to use the crafting overlay interface, and even longer to get a working version of my first minion, Cynthia 2.0. Getting a handle on the process had consumed so much of my time, I hadn't gotten around to Runic Resonance Trap. I aimed to remedy that oversight before thoroughly exploring the 5th floor, known by most as Hotel Hell. Every time I ventured out into the wild expanse of the backrooms, it was a calculated risk. I wanted to make sure as shit that I was doing everything in my power to increase my chances of survival, and that meant getting a handle on my newest ability. I let Jacob know I would be indisposed for the better part of a day to prepare for the delve, then stopped by the checkout counter to grab a few extra Zima healing elixirs. Playing with extremely volatile magical traps was a dangerous proposition, all the more so because I had no idea what in the hell I was doing. I really needed to add a dedicated practice space to the store, but sadly I didn't have anything like that just yet. So instead, Croc and I cordoned off the home decor aisle with some bright yellow cushion tape someone had traded in, and then, because I really didn't want any accidental casualties, I had baby hands post up at the end of the aisle, to shoo away prospective rubberneckers. I pulled out the Runic Resonance Trap relic, which looked like a rusted bar trap with nasty metal teeth. The description popped up as I examined the item more closely. Runic Resonance Trap. Uncommon relic, level 1. Range, uncontact. Cost, 15 mana. Cast time, 20 seconds. Duration, until activated. Material component, 1x Runic Engraver's All Artifact, 1x Compatible Surface. If you've been in the backrooms for longer than 2 minutes, you've likely stumbled across, or been irreparably maimed by, one of these bad boys. This is the most versatile of the 3 basic bitch backroom traps: runes, tripwires, and pitfalls. Nothing fancy, but it'll get the job done. Some moron blunders along and bam. It's raining men. Well, pieces of men, anyway. Or women. Or monsters. Or you. This thing doesn't discriminate. Use a trap with Sol to inscribe an invisible conductor rune onto any compatible material surface and it was said rune with a mana-based effect. You must cast the spell to store it. All mana spell costs remain the same, but the stored spell effect is reduced by 50%. That's called mana leakage for you technical sorts. How much mana any given rune can contain depends upon the relic level. This relic enables mana usage. The relic description only gave me broad brush strokes of how the ability worked, but when I swapped out Waldree's Scale Mail Kairas, a rare great relic, which boosted toughness, and added runic resonance trapped to my spatial core. A wave of insight flooded my mind, unfurling in the back of my skull like some strange flower. A rather simple symbol tattooed itself directly onto my brain. A basic trap rune. I also had a rough idea of how the sigil functioned. The rune itself acted as a rudimentary mana battery capable of holding a magical charge. But it wasn't just the energy it held. It was the shape of that energy. I hadn't realized it until now, but in that moment, it occurred to me that there was no essential difference between the mana that created my sterilization field and the mana that summoned a storm of corrosive super bleach, capable of melting organic matter into a pile of burbling goo. It was all the same essence. The only difference was the shape the essence took, and that was the purpose of the relics. They molded mana in a specific pattern, forcing it to move in certain ways and take certain forms, like molten metal flowing into a casting die. Despite what they looked like on the outside, on the inside, each relic was really just a complex construction of different runes and sigils that told the energy channeled through it what to do, how to behave. It was supernatural programming code. That explained why relics that superficially looked different, say a Kamo kit and an invisible ink pen, had the same end result, basic camouflage. Because they had the same internal programming structure. That's also why I needed to cast the spell to set the trap in the first place. The trap rune wasn't capable of shaping mana, it just held the current configuration, storing it for later use. I wasn't sure what to do with any of that information, but somehow, I knew the revelation was vitally important. It was also something for future me to worry about. Once the imminent threat of death and war weren't hanging over me like a headman's axe, I could afford to be a magical armchair philosopher. For now, though, the important thing was that I could use these runes to kill shit, and there were a whole lot of things in the back rooms that needed killing. At face value, the inscription process was quite simple. Step 1, use the engraver's awl to carve the conductor rune into a compatible surface. Step 2, cast a compatible spell and the rune would soak the magic up like a dry sponge, storing it for later use. Step 3, profit. In theory, easy. In reality? Well, that was quite a bit more complicated. What exactly constituted a compatible surface or spell? Could I store effects fueled by stamina? How temperamental were the runes and under what conditions would they activate? Did the activation conditions change based on the type of spell stored? If I carved the rune incorrectly, would the whole thing blow up in my face? I had a dozen or more questions and no answers, which is exactly why I needed to experiment. The first thing I quickly discovered was that the runes were, in fact, wildly unstable and finicky. In many ways, they reminded me of my ex-girlfriend Sheila, who'd once set fire to my underwear drawer and slashed my truck tires for reasons I still didn't fully understand. And, just like my ex, the conductor runes were just as liable to blow up in my face as they were to blast an enemy. There didn't seem to be a safe way to practice until I figured out that offensive spells weren't the only ones that could successfully be stored. Relic effects fueled by stamina didn't work at all, but everything else was fair game, including things like pharmacist scales, bad trip, or even mental micromanagement. It took a little trial and error, but eventually I worked out the kinks. First off, the size of the mana battery, which is how I'd come to think of the runes, was directly proportional to the relic level. The rune could hold approximately 10 mana worth of energy for every level. So, at level 1, the rune could only contain spell effects that cost 10 mana or less to cast. If I tried to pump in more mana than that, boom. The rune became unstable, and the spell would detonate on the spot, blowing up in my face and doing a decent chunk of damage in the process. I damn near lost a finger learning that particular lesson. I'd made quite the scene. Hunched over, clutching the ruined stump with my thumb while blood spurted across the floor every time my heart thumped. The whole aisle soon looked like a scene out of one of those Saw movies. Thankfully, my thumb had stayed attached by a thin thread of skin, and a greater healing Zima fixed me up without issue. Unfortunately, I was pretty sure I'd permanently traumatized my other new hire, Stephanie, who'd come running when she heard me caterwauling like a wounded baboon. She'd puked all over the blood-covered aisle, before darting off to get help. Some of the barf splashed onto my bathrobe, reminding me once again why getting a magical laundry mat was so worthwhile. Thankfully, Baby Hans was made of sterner stuff and had a much stronger stomach. Well, he didn't have any stomach, technically. With the golem's help, we had the aisle back to normal in less than 20 minutes. Still, not my finest moment. After that, I decided upgrading the relic was at the tippy top of my priority list. The store had acquired 47 trash-tier relics over the past several days. Things like the beer goggles, which distorted depth perception and made the user's vision slightly blurry while offering no tangible benefit. Or a relic that resembled a plastic bottle of medicated foot powder called powder of persistent itching. That one caused the user to experience an incessant itching sensation at random intervals and in random places. One moment the itching might be between your toes, the next it felt like super crabs crawling all over your crotch. I genuinely couldn't fathom why it existed. Needless to say, the relics were so utterly worthless that I couldn't even forge them into something less shitty, not even with the researcher's codex to assist me. The only thing they were fit for was sacrifice. I burned through 20 of them, cannibalizing the power contained within. That brought my shiny new trap relic up to level 5, allowing it to store up to 50 points of mana. Enough to accommodate even my most heavy-hitting spells like Stinslayer Maelstrom or Sterilization Field, not that I planned to practice with those spells. I had no desire to set off a chemical monsoon inside my store. But the upgrade meant I wouldn't have to worry about accidentally overcharging the conductor rune and subsequently losing more body parts. That wasn't the only benefit either. Level 5 was the first advancement threshold, and whenever a relic surpassed a threshold, it evolved in some fundamental way. Sometimes it became more powerful. Other times it would unlock an additional effect or secondary ability. The results were unpredictable and dependent on the relic itself, but the changes were always an improvement in some way. In this case, I unlocked a new secondary ability called Runic Outhandler. It allowed me to safely touch or handle any runes I'd personally carved without setting them off. It also granted me a 10% increased chance to safely dismantle runic traps crafted by someone else. With the relic upgraded, the secondary ability unlocked, and a tsunami of fun and deadly ideas dancing through my head, Croc and I took another stab at things. Chapter 8 Engraver all firmly in hand, I also carefully carved the twisting, hook-shaped rune directly into the white linoleum of the home decor aisle. As I finished, the rune sank into the floor, disappearing to Croc, but remaining semi-visible to me. The fresh sigil was ghostly in appearance and glistened with a watery opal light. I tossed a pillow onto the rune to see if anything would happen. Nada. Croc went next, placing a tentative paw on the invisible trap, its body ridged and braced for impact. But once again, the sigil was completely inert. When I placed my hand against the rune, however, a subtle tingle passed through my palm and the hairs along the length of my arm stood at attention. Taking a deep breath, I cast Pharmacis Scales, exchanging 10 points of mana for 10 points of health. My mana gauge appeared in the corner of my eye and dipped accordingly as the spell leached directly into the rune and vanished. Although the sigil stayed invisible to Croc, as the spell took hold, the pattern changed from shifting opalescence to a subtle gold hue. We tried the pillow trick again, tossing it onto the rune from a safe distance, but ended up with the same result. A whole lot of nothing. When Croc cautiously stepped onto the rune, though, there was a brilliant flash of light and the effect activated, instantly transferring a grand total of 5 points of health into my four-legged friend. When Croc stepped away, the rune was gone, no sign it had ever been there at all. Once I understood the basic mechanic, I tried a wider range of spells. Mental micromanagement was the first. That time, the sigil glowed with an etheric blue light. Once again, the pillow produced no tangible result but, curiously, when Croc tried, the rune flashed, but promptly fizzled and disappeared without any obvious effect either. The mimic had felt nothing, which was puzzling at first. But the more I thought about it, the more sense it made. mental micromanagement could only lift things that weighed less than 45 pounds. And, thanks to the issue with mana leakage, the spell effect was further reduced by 50%, meaning it could only lift objects up to 22.5 pounds. Croc weighed substantially more. It was a simple math equation. Even though the trap activated, it didn't have enough metaphysical oomph to get the job done, so nothing had happened. That discovery had broader implications. Although I could use spells like Bad Trip, if the target's perception score wasn't lower than mine, chances were high the trap would gutter and die. A complete waste of resources. And I had no idea how the mana leakage would factor into the equation. Spells with guaranteed effects, like Pharmacist's Scales or Lenmeyer's Molotov Cocktail, were best. I'd picked up several Molotov Cocktail relics from the pharmacy text that had previously called the mediocre mart home, and I'd kept one in my personal stash for emergency situations. The relic was basically a rudimentary fireball spell, quick, easy, and dirty, that dealt a flat 15 points of damage on contact and 5 points of additional burn damage while within the area of effect. The spell damage and duration were cut in half, but they worked every single time. Croc and I tested out a wide variety of different relics with plenty of elixirs on standby in case things went south. Time and time again, we saw that inanimate objects failed to trigger the runes, although the rules seemed strange and somewhat arbitrary. I took off my boot and tossed it onto a sigil. Not a damn thing happened. But if there was a foot inside said boot, boom. The trap worked like a charm. There were rules to it, I was sure, but I felt too dumb to figure them out. My big takeaway from the initial round of experimentation was that delvers and dwellers would trigger the runes every single time they made direct contact. Sure, it was possible there were exceptions to that rule, but 99 out of 100 times, when a living object made contact the rune activated. Period. End of story. But my official and very scientific research didn't end there. The relic description said that I could scroll the rune onto any compatible material surface, but it didn't actually specify what that was. The floor was the most logical choice. I'd seen loads of runic pressure plates embedded into the floors, after all, but the question had to be asked, what other items qualified? This relic had originally come from Frank, who'd hurled magical barrels at me from a distance. Was it possible that all of those barrels had simply been runic resonances traps, inscribed onto the wooden barrel slats? With that thought kicking around inside my skull, Croc and I began a second round of experimentation, and we had a whole store worth of items to work with. We once again started with the throw pillow, then moved on from there. Cereal boxes, notebooks, tools from the hardware section. Hell, I even etched individual slices of bread. We found that almost anything could be engraved with a handful of notable exceptions. First off, the surface area had to be large enough to accommodate a detailed sigil. The material didn't matter so much, but the size sure did. Trying to squeeze a rune onto the face of a quarter just wouldn't work because my awl was too big and clunky for that kind of precision work. Second, I couldn't carve relics, artifacts, or living creatures. I managed to etch a sigil onto a slice of ham from the grocery section, which told me it might be possible to carve dead things, which boded well for me since my taxidermid horrors weren't technically living. I conjured Drumbo rebooted and had no issue carving a sigil right into his belly. That had real, long-term potential. As unsettling as it was, I foresaw taxidermid suicide bombers in the not-too-distant future. I couldn't carve anything with an active pulse, though. I'd learned that lesson firsthand when I tried to etch a rune into my leg just for pure shits and giggles. Not only did the rune fail to take, but the process hurt like a real son of a bitch. Felt like brushing up against the hot stove burner even though it didn't leave a mark on my body or drain my health bar by even a sliver. My working theory was that anything that already contained mana of some form, relics, artifacts, people, disrupted the stability of the sigil, preventing it from holding the correct spell configuration. Still, the ability to inscribe damn near anything else opened a whole new world of interesting and murderous possibilities. Although setting a runic trap on the floor had its uses, Turning a loaf of bread into a magical hand grenade was way more practical. And cool. So that's exactly what I set out to do next. The seasonal aisle had a shit ton of bright green tennis balls. Up until now, they hadn't really served any obvious purpose, but they were perfect for what I had in mind. Lightweight, just the right size, easy to throw, and plentiful. If not for the secondary run-out handling ability, this plan never would have worked. The traps were just too volatile. Because I could safely touch them without activating the conductor rune, however, it took no time at all to transform the mountain of useless tennis balls into a not-so-useless arsenal of magical munitions. Motion didn't trigger the runes at all. Chucking the things wouldn't set them off, and they wouldn't explode unless they contacted a living target. They were the perfect ranged weapon for a spellcaster like me, who relied almost entirely on mana-intensive skills and abilities. That was even more true once I realized I could manipulate and move my impromptu magical hand grenades with telekinesis, just like I'd done with Frank's barrels. The tennis balls went from simple ranged weapons into honest-to-God homing missiles. They also gave me an incredible amount of versatility. The hard truth was that my spatial core could only hold 10 relics at any given point, but nothing prevented me from exchanging those relics at will. But there was a catch. There was always a catch. Trying to swap relics during the middle of a battle was both insane and impractical, but with this, I could store a wide array of additional spell effects and, because the spells were all cast beforehand, they wouldn't affect my available mana pool. I'd need to be proactive, sure, but that was fine. No one would ever accuse me of being the next Albert Einstein, but thinking ahead had always been one of my strong suits. I made my way over to the cosmetics aisle and grabbed 3 of the basic Delver kits we'd prepared for new arrivals. Each kit consisted of a backpack, looted from the nearby Style for Less department store, crammed full of the bare necessities for survival. Basic toiletries, a first aid kit, and a flashlight. Machete or survival knife and rope. Bottles of water and bags of beef jerky, and protein bars. Things like that. The backpacks lined the shelves of aisle 4, and every level 0 Delver who stumbled through the doors got one free of charge. I couldn't afford to give away artifacts and relics, my resources were too limited for that, but I could afford to give away the Delver kits, and I knew they'd already saved dozens of people. Including my 2 new human employees, Taylor and Stephanie. I grabbed 3 backpacks, 1 red, 1 purple, 1 yellow, and dumped the contents. Baby hands would repack them later. Bags in hand, I went back to the cordoned-off home decor aisle. I carefully spread a tarp across the floor, then systemically laid out 2 dozen tennis balls in a neat 4x6 grid. The last thing I wanted to do was accidentally set one of my friends on fire by mixing up grenade types in the heat of combat. To prevent that, I spray-painted all 24 of them purple, then set to work with my engravers all once the paint was dry. It took me almost 2 hours to imbue each of the tennis balls with health regen, but it was worth the effort. I'd maxed out the amount of mana I could invest in the individual conductor runes, which meant each grenade could heal for 25 points of damage. They were almost as good as a lesser healing elixir and way faster to use on the fly. I put all of those into the purple backpack and then, just to make it idiot-proof, I slapped a strip of silver duct tape across the front of the bag and wrote health grenades. I would have loved to craft some mana regen grenades, but my run-out handler skill worked against me on that front. Thanks to the threshold ability, I couldn't actively set the runes off even if I wanted to. True, I could make all the mana grenades I wanted, but I'd only be able to use them on others, and that just seemed like a waste of time and effort. Instead, I crafted 24 more tennis balls, then imbued them with the effects from one of my most volatile but powerful relics, Burn Baby Burn. Those I spray-painted Fire Engine red so they would stand out in sharp contrast with the purple healing grenades. After accounting for the mana leakage, each fuzzy, red IED dealt just shy of 20 points of flame damage on contact, and an additional 10 points of burn damage for 1 minute. Individually, that wasn't overly impressive, but if shit really went sideways, I could use all of them at once. That was 720 total points worth of damage, Plus getting set on fire doubled as one hell of a nasty distraction. It was hard to focus on fighting when your skin was burning. That backpack I labeled firebombs. I repeated the process once more, this time spray painting and filling the yellow backpack with tennis balls imbued with the spell effects from Fault Spike. Fault Spike. Uncommon Relic, Level 1. Range, Line of Sight. Cost, 5-50 mana. Cast time, 2 seconds. Duration, Permanent terrain alteration. Taking the phrase "get fucked" to a whole new level, Fault Spike summons between 1 and 10 razor-sharp earthen shafts capable of spit-roasting your enemies like a luau pig. Because luau pig is definitely what you were thinking when I said spit-roast. Fault Spikes are considered permanent terrain alterations and will stay put until the backrooms decides to undo your handiwork, so don't place them anywhere you don't want them long-term. Each spike deals 25 points of piercing damage on contact and the target is afflicted with 1 stack of uncontrollable hemorrhaging, dealing 2 points of bleed damage for each second they are impaled. Another stack of uncontrollable hemorrhaging is applied every 5 seconds. If 5 stacks of uncontrollable hemorrhaging accumulate, the target suffers earthbarb and any attempts to remove the spear deals an additional 25 points of tearing damage. This relic enables mana usage. In theory, each one of the balls would summon a single razor-sharp javelin of rock from the ground, capable of impaling an enemy. I was particularly excited to see those bad boys in action. Another strip of duct tape went across the front. I wrote spikes of "Go fuck yourself" in big blocky letters. I jammed 2 tennis balls of each color into the oversized pouch on my 2-0 belt. Then deposited all 3 backpacks into my subspace storage for later. In total, the entire process, experimentation, severing my thumb, learning the ropes, and mass-producing the tennis balls grenades, had taken about 9 hours. After everything that had happened over the past day, I should have been exhausted to the bone. But I wasn't. I was too keyed up to sleep. All I really wanted to do was head down to the 5th floor and look for something to try my shiny new runic bombs on. Far as I was concerned, I could sleep when I was dead. I took a few minutes to splash some water on my face, then I scarfed down a couple of hot dogs from the concession stand, earning myself the coveted gas station hot dog buff in the process. For the next 3 hours, I was safe from food poisoning and all damage from disease was reduced by 5%. I also took a moment to adjust the relics in my spatial core. Now that I had an ample number of both healing elixirs and healing grenades, I opted to swap my level 5 pharmacist scales for Bad Trip, one of the few crowd control abilities in my arsenal. Then I double-checked my active relics. Spatial core, active. U. Bad Trip, level 1. U. Fault Spike, level 3. U. Runic Resonance Trap, level 5. R. Unhinged Taxidermist, level 1. R. Mental Micromanagement, level 1. R. Pressure Washer, level 5. R. Sterilization Field, level 5. F. Neural Slipstream, level 5. F. Stainslayer Maelstrom, level 5. Fully tempered, me. Compass of the Catacomber, fully tempered. Satisfied with my current loadout, the only thing left to do was find Jacob, then make our way to Hotel Hell. I had a magical washing machine to find. Chapter 9. The 5th floor, often referred to as Hotel Hell, was a huge expanse of claustrophobic interconnected corridors, interspersed with lavish bedrooms, opulent lounges, and gaudy ballrooms. Of all the levels I'd visited so far, it reminded me most of the lobby, though instead of a bland office building this level looked like a posh luxury hotel. Still, it had the same foreboding atmosphere. It was the press of the walls. The endless sea of monotonous wallpaper. The disorienting hallways that all looked the same and all went nowhere. A miasma of paranoia seemed to hang in the air like a cloud, and it felt like we were being watched by a sea of invisible onlookers. Gaudy gold and crystal chandeliers dangled from frescoed ceilings, casting warm light across polished marble floors. The soft, distant sounds of a piano drifted through the air, mingling with the muffled chatter of unseen patrons. Crushed velvet drapes framed arched windows that looked out into nowhere, while plush armchairs, ornate tapestries, and gilded mirrors hinted at an era of unparalleled luxury. It was impossible to miss the earthy scent of cigars waltzing with a hint of floral perfume. The whole floor was like stepping into a Stephen King novel. And, like any good Stephen King novel, there were monsters here. They weren't as plentiful as the dwellers on the 3rd floor or the 7th, but they made up for their lack of numbers with extreme violence and wild unpredictability. We'd already taken out a handful of mimics, disguised as everything from mirrors to high-back chairs, all of which were far more convincing than anything Croc could pull off. We even had a chandelier mimic with 100 mouth orifices drop down on us from overhead. I'd been so busy searching the floor for traps that I didn't see the mean old son of a bitch until it landed on me like an angry gorilla. It took a bite out of my thigh the size of an apple before Jacob used his blue plasma shield to cut the monster in two. An ice cold messed up the bleeding and Jacob used some strange salve that smelled like fermented nutsack to regrow the missing chunk of flesh. Good times. Most of the mimics, I killed at a distance. The bastards didn't show up on my minimap, one of the perks of their camouflage ability, but thankfully Spelunker's sixth sense helped me spot the things long before they ever became a real threat. I cut them down with pressure washer or skewered them with my telekinetically controlled demolition screwdriver. They dropped like swatted flies, dark blood and goopy itchers splattering across the walls and carpeted floor. Most were level 8, which meant no experience for killing them, and only the chandelier mimic was above level 10. Still, I managed to collect a bunch of basic camouflage relics and a few shards, not to mention a handful of common-grade relics called Ambush Instinct, which served as a watered-down version of my Spelunker's sixth sense. I didn't need them for obvious reasons, but I had no doubt those things would sell like hotcakes at the store. The chandelier shith had also dropped an additional uncommon relic called Health Eater, which I'd never seen before. At first, I assumed it would be some sort of leech life ability which, in one sense, it was. Unfortunately, the way you gained life was by literally devouring your enemies. The relic converted physically consumed mass into health. Apparently, this was one of the many abilities Croc had tucked away in its spatial core. In theory, it was an extremely powerful skill and perfect for a monster with a mouth the size of trash compactor and a hankering for some long pork. It was far less appetizing for me. We'd also run across several hotel porters, who were not so different from the greeters that roamed the endless lobby of Level 0. They were gangly, pot-bellied creatures with luminous eyes, stringy hair, and unnaturally wide smiles filled with far too many teeth. The porters wore tattered red hotel uniforms and conical bellhop caps perched on misshapen heads. Most were level 7 or 8 and should have run away, but instead they attacked on sight with reckless abandon and extreme violence. Not that their enthusiasm for carnage helped them much. Killing Frank and the others had finally pushed Jacob up to level 26, while I was at level 22. Although Croc was still only level 19, the mimic was still more than powerful enough to kill damn near anything on this floor without breaking a sweat. 9 out of 10 times, I killed the flappy guns before they ever got within spitting distance. Pressure washer carved through their rubbery flesh as though it were made of tissue paper, and I had ample opportunity to test out my tennis balls. The yellow fault spike grenades were ruthlessly effective. A single well-placed tennis ball to the throat could one-shot the dopey monsters and drop them where they stood. As for the firebombs, turned out all the greasy hair was extremely flammable. Like the low-level mimics, they didn't give us any experience, but they all carried a combination of shards and relics. Silent Step and Baggage Handler were the most frequent drops. Silent Step allowed the caster to move 35% more quietly, but only on carpeted surfaces, while Baggage Handler offered a small boost to athleticism and increased total storage space capacity by 500 pounds. I idly wondered if that was how Wraith and the Howlers had acquired all those shipping containers. Although Baggage Handler was only a common grade relic, it stood to reason that there were probably uncommon or even rare grade versions of the ability, which would let someone store substantially more. At one point, we tangled with a blight-infected level 15 night shift manager, a multi-armed horror decked out in a pristine black suit and a silver bellhop cap. That one dropped an uncommon grade relic called Baggage Strike, which encumbered all those in the hour radius by increasing the weight of all worn items by 40% for the duration of the spell. The nightmarish creature also carried an uncommon artifact called Hotel Maintenance Key, which served as a master key for every single door on the 5th floor, including the employees-only service doors, which connected to the floor's maintenance corridors. Instinct told me that's where we would eventually find the laundromat. Then, there were the things that lived inside the rooms themselves. The lodgers. They were, far and away, the most traumatizing horrors inhabiting the hotel. Mostly because they were far more unique than their counterparts, who roamed the halls. They were all labeled simply as lodgers and had the same basic description, provided courtesy of the Codex. Hotel lodger. The poor, unfortunate guests who checked in but never quite managed to check out. Be careful or you might end up just like them. Like the faceless ghouls who inhabited the 1st floor, I had a terrible suspicion that these things hadn't always been dwellers. And that was because most of them looked like people. Some tall, others short. Men and women, both. Even a few kids, which was worst of all. They'd been changed by the backrooms, of course. Pale and oddly bloated as though they'd been submerged in water for too long. Their limbs were stretched in unnatural ways. Their jaws, elongated to accommodate for all their extra teeth. It made me sick to think about, but I was betting money that these were the poor schmucks who'd accidentally wandered into hotel hell and never found an exit. Instead of simply dying, the hotel had kept them as eternal guests, never to depart. They rarely left the rooms, but we still had to deal with them occasionally because I was actively on the hunt for something other than the sacred laundromat. I mean, sure, that was my #1 priority, but I'd finally discovered a floor that had access to both decent beds and, most importantly of all, bathrooms with working showers. It was an opportunity I couldn't afford to pass up. True, most of the beds were actually enormous flytraps, which would slowly eat you as you slept, while most of the showers rained acid instead of water, but most wasn't all. I was certain that there was at least one normal room in this godforsaken place. It took more tries than I'd like to admit, but an erring arrow had finally guided us to a room that fit my needs. And it wasn't one of the run-of-the-mill rooms, either, the kind with a couple of full beds and a bathroom so small you could hardly take a shit without bumping your knees against the wall. Nope, this was one of the deluxe suites, which came stock with a separate master bedroom, a sitting and dining area, 2 different bathrooms, and even its small kitchenette edged on one side by a bar top, complete with high-top stools. It was nice. Not even remotely my style, but nice. The chairs were leather, the sofa velvet, and there were mirrors absolutely everywhere. Too many mirrors for good taste, in my opinion, plus it had one of those fancy crystal chandeliers suspended above the dining room table. I couldn't help but think about the mimic who'd taken a chunk out of my leg when I saw that monstrosity, but thankfully it was just furniture. There was, however, the current hotel lodger to consider. It jumped into one of the paintings. Jacob called out, surveying the room with reptilian eyes. Searching for any sign of movement. "You see anything, Croc?" I called out, even as the hairs along the back of my neck stood at attention. "Oh fiddlesticks, Dan." I lost track of it, the dog called from the master bedroom. "Just great," I muttered, turning in a slow circle. "Stay in the bedroom, Croc," I called, already backtracking from the sitting room and toward the kitchen. "We don't want this slippery shit to get away. Not if I wanted to claim the room, anyway." The only problem with my blanket fort ability was that I couldn't claim a territory which was currently under the control of a hostile dweller. Naturally, each and every lodger counted as a boss for their individual room. "Just be careful, Dan," Jacob called from the room's larger foyer. "This thing is nastier than the others." Tricky. The Sendril was currently camped out by the front door, making sure the monster didn't slip away and that we had a clear exit in case things went sideways. Which tended to be the rule instead of the exception. "Don't need to tell me twice," I called back. I slowly padded through the room, taking time to peek behind furniture and under the table, but I didn't see anything. I hadn't seen any sign of the lodger yet, but I was sure that would change before too much longer. Honestly, these things were more annoying than dangerous, but holy shit did they have a tendency to jump scare you at the worst possible moment. And even with badass magic powers, a good jump scare was still a good jump scare. There was a blur of movement in the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, hammer raised and ready to strike, whatever had been there was already long gone. I moved past the table and around the edge of the bar. My steps faltered when I caught sight of a large painting hanging on the wall. It was out of place, and the sight of it sent goosebumps racing across my arms. I inched forward to get a better look at the thing and froze. The painting showcased an oceanside harbor at twilight with a small fleet of boats moored against the encroaching darkness of the night. The sky was a brilliant canvas of purples and blues, reflecting off the white-tipped waves. Honestly, there was nothing special about the painting. It looked like the kind of thing an airport Marriott might have in the lobby. Corporate and uninspired. The figure, frozen near the weathered dock, on the other hand, stood out like a road flare. Like the other lodgers we'd run across, he was man-shaped and rail-thin, almost skeletally so, and seemed to be made almost entirely of arms and legs. He wore pleated gray slacks and a gray sports jacket with a scarlet vest beneath. Shiny gold buttons ran up the front of the vest, and what looked like a gray tie dangled down from its neck. Except, upon closer inspection, I realized it wasn't a tie at all, but a length of frayed noose. Its head was pale, round, and maggot white, which reminded me of a peeled hard-boiled egg. Beady black eyes stared at me from above a vicious mop bristling with hundreds of needle-sharp teeth. Sitting on top of that egg-shaped skull was a gray bowler hat that matched the jacket and trousers. Gangly arms stretched all the way down past its knees and splintery fingers, with far too many joints, continued to the wooden slats of the dock. All I could do was stand there and stare at the monstrosity, captivated by how horrifying it was. I felt frozen was the only word that came to mind. My limbs were oddly numb and too heavy to lift. My right arm went slack and my hammer thudded to the floor. It all happened in slow motion, almost as if I were in a dream, but there was nothing I could do about it. I'd felt this sensation once before, back during my battle against the blighted photophage, who occupied the photo center in the mediocre mart. Which meant I was under psychic attack, but now, just like then, there wasn't a damn thing I could do about it. This son of a bitch was using some sort of relic that specifically targeted my grit, which was one of my lowest stats, sitting at only 17. Absolutely nothing, especially when compared to my highest stat, resonance, which was currently at 55. Grit was closely related to willpower and measured overall ability to resist sonic attacks and psychic influence. Clearly, I needed an upgrade in that department. "Behind you, Dan," Croc bellowed from the other room. The sound of the mimic's voice jarred me out of my momentary stupor, but my body still felt sluggish and unresponsive. I spun at the warning, but it felt like I was moving through a wall of molasses. I finished turning just in time to see the lanky figure from the painting leap out from a nearby mirror. The noose encircling its throat shot out like a serpent, growing to an absurd length as it wrapped around my arms, pinning them to my sides. And as the rope constricted, my renewed sense of willpower drained away like sand running through my fingers. "This is hopeless," my brain screamed. "You never should have come here. Now you're going to die, and no one will even care." I wanted to argue, but the voice was right. This was hopeless. Another coil of rope looped around my neck, and I knew I was done for. What in the hell was the point of even trying to fight back? Any attempt at resistance was an exercise in futility. All I could do was stand and watch in frozen horror as the creature unhinged its lower jaw and moved forward to swallow my head whole. Tope continued,